Yeah, great. And so are folks mostly muted at this point? Looks like a lot of people are muted, which is good, probably. So it sounds like, I think with this number of people, if we don't get a whole lot more, if we don't get more than like 15 people, we can probably have a discussion at the end where everybody mutes and unmutes themselves, and we won't need to use the chat box, because I think this is a reasonable number of people to have a conversation. So we'll just kind of play that one by ear. So I am Savanna Lyons, and I work at Iowa State. I'm part of the local foods team with Lynn. I just graduated with my master's degree in economics and sustainable agriculture. But before I came to Iowa State, I was the director of the West Virginia Food and Farm Coalition, which was a statewide organization working to build community food systems in West Virginia. And we had a very large mission that we were charged with by a community development organization that was our umbrella. And I think probably the challenges that I faced in that position were very similar to the challenges that a lot of people face who are given these sort of broad job descriptions that deal with building local food systems, or who are trying to take on the process of building local food systems maybe as a part of their job, but without a lot of like clear direction. And so I wanted to share, as part of this peer-to-peer call series, some things that I learned from my experience about coaching, which turned out to be very, very helpful for me in kind of building power for our movement in West Virginia, and building kind of my personal, I guess, improving myself personally, and also building capital for myself, social capital for myself. And this is the first of a series of kind of webinar peer discussion calls that we've been envisioning at the local food team for some time, because we knew that folks who are involved with RFSWIG or involved with local food were interested in having more FaceTime with each other to talk about kind of how you're working through problems, solving problems, and what kinds of things you're doing. And so we've kind of designed these discussions as a mini presentation at the beginning, where somebody presents something they've been thinking about or doing, or something they've learned, and then we have a group discussion where everybody kind of shares what they've learned and what their thoughts are on the topic. So it's very interactive. It's not just a presentation, and we're really hoping that folks will want to continue to participate in these, and that we can do them every month or every other month, and kind of have them guided by you all, by practitioners. So I'm just starting this out using my experiences as a practitioner, but I happen to work for Extension, but it really could be anybody who would lead one of these discussions. And Lynn will talk more about that at the end. So I'm going to kind of kick it off with this little PowerPoint that I put together, and then invite you all to kind of chime in with some thoughts. I'm going to try to share my screen, so let's see how this goes. Okay, is everybody able to see that? Can you see a slide? Okay, yeah, good. Okay, so this is called Coaching Colleagues, Leaders, and Allies, and I'm going to try not to get up on a soapbox too much during this, but well, I'll just jump in. So, okay, so so my organization was the West Virginia Food and Farm Coalition, and I started it, and I ran it for 3 years. Or 3.5 years. It was part of the West Virginia Community Development Hub. And we were kind of given this task of helping to improve healthy food access through local food, and also developing the food and farm economy statewide. And I was hired on as one person who was 26 years old, who was going to come in and build a local food movement in West Virginia, because there really wasn't a consolidated movement. There wasn't a group of people who were all talking to each other, and there wasn't a lot of programming around local food. Extension really wasn't very active. We didn't really have a statewide forum for talking about connections between kind of food and health, and then the production side. And so that's what we were charged to do, without a whole lot of direction. And so some of the things that we did that really involved a lot of coaching of individuals, as it turned out, as well as collaboration with institutions as a whole, were the things on the screen. So we this is kind of in addition to, so the first thing we did was we put together a food charter. We had like listening sessions all over the state, and we picked out these 5 core goals that we wanted to meet as a state for advancing food systems. And it was like connecting youth with agriculture and getting more local food into institutions and things like that. And then to try to realize those goals, we developed a bunch of programming. And so one of the things we did was these 5 practitioner-led working groups, which we facilitated. We secured some money to support them, to give them funding for a chair for an individual who is a practitioner to lead each of the groups. We also provided them with some project money and a structure to define what their project would be and make a budget for their work, and kind of an annual check-in process to help them define what they'd be doing each year. We provided an annual conference where all the working groups came together, touched base about how their projects were going, and then presented them to a large group of people, which included legislators, members of different agencies like USDA and the Department of Agriculture at the state level, folks who controlled resources and were in the position to make decisions. And so the idea was to bring together practitioners who are people like teachers running school gardens for the school garden working group, or farmers who are trying to access meat processing facility for the meat processing working group, and allow them to articulate their challenges, to work towards solving some of those challenges through projects of their own, and then to be able to present those projects and kind of what they learned and what they wanted to see next to people who controlled resources. So it was really a project to link people to their institutions that were supposed to be serving them, both through sort of the political side, through legislative contacts, and through also through the administrative side. So by getting them in front of people who controlled resources at the Department of Agriculture, or in the school system, we had the person who was controlled funding for the school lunch program in the state at these meetings. So this was a job, this was a project, this was sort of how we chose to mobilize people around local food systems and to try to move our institutions towards more coordinated support for the things that practitioners felt were important. And it was pretty successful, but involved a lot of coaching. We also worked closely with a fiscal sponsor, which was a community development nonprofit. And I mentioned that because that was another instance where coaching skills were really effective, because we were working with folks who had some power over us and controlled our money, our bank accounts, but who also had a lot to learn from us. And it turned out that relationship involved some coaching in both directions to mutual benefit. And we co-coordinated a lot of programming. So we did everything from, we ended up writing a grant with a community development financial institution, and we got a little over $1 million to do food business technical assistance around the state for value chain businesses. And those folks, the partner that we worked with, the Community Development Financial Institution, was sort of our primary partner, but we also worked with Extension and the Department of Agriculture to deliver gap trainings and trainings on marketing and trainings on a variety of topics all around the state, and then to work with individual business owners to help them meet their needs. And so that was a coaching project that was directed towards business owners, but there was also a lot of coordination with partners that I think there was learning on both ends. We put together a series of buyer-grower meet and greets with local partners in different locations, and we kind of worked with them on cultivating relationships between local growers and buyers who they had in their areas, who they wanted to cultivate as local food buyers, including restaurants and institutions. So that was a coaching process that where we helped those local organizations to sort of figure out how to build these connections. And then as a director of a nonprofit, I mentored a lot of folks, VISTA volunteers, staff who came in, and also colleagues who were doing aligned work. And I found that mentoring colleagues became a big part of my job. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of my experiences, and then I'm going to talk about some resources I found on coaching, and then we're going to go back to my experiences and then to your experiences. But I really feel like coaching work is sometimes the most important work that we can do. And and I found this after I left my organization and came to Iowa State to go to grad school, that the relationships I developed and the people that I'd helped to cultivate themselves were the things that had the most impact into the future. So these are some reasons why I think coaching is important. And by coaching, I might be using this word kind of broadly, but I think coaching is a process of helping people to identify what their challenges are, develop action plans to meet their challenges, but also helping them work through sometimes some of the personal barriers or sort of emotional barriers that people are facing in themselves, as well as addressing external challenges to reaching their goals. And so that's why coaching is different from training, because I think training is, teaching somebody how to sort of follow a plan to maybe achieve a goal. Coaching is more about listening and helping someone recognize and see their own problems, and then and recognize both internal and external problems and address them. I'll talk about some steps for that in a minute. So coaching builds power. This is something I learned early on, and a lot of local food practitioners are women, and a lot of us are young women, and it's something that I learned coming into the agriculture kind of sector at a young age without a whole lot of background in agriculture previously, is that I had very little social capital in what I was trying to do. And I had to build social capital really quickly to be effective. And I found that one of those, it's, if you ever heard the term the weapons of the weak, I felt like I needed some weapons of the weak to be able to strengthen myself, to use whatever I had to bring to the table to build some power for our movement. And so one of the ways I did that was by being a listener for other people. And so I developed relationships with prominent farmers in the state, many of them women who were dealing with the frustrations of being women farmers. I dealt with extension agents who felt frustrated by maybe the powers that be and how they were being evaluated and not being able to focus on the things they wanted to focus on. I dealt with a lot of different kinds of people who had frustrations, and I became a listener for those folks, and I helped them try to work through their problems. And that built a lot of social capital for me, which I was able to leverage later. And also trusting relationships, so that when it was time to go after funding together, or when I said I was going to do something, people believed me, what I said. So coaching also moves agendas forward, and this kind of related. So I think people who are within an institution, maybe where they're trying to pursue a goal like food justice, or focusing more on local and smaller producers and less on, or in addition to focusing on large conventional producers, sometimes people are isolated in that work, even if they're in a large, powerful institution, have access to resources. And they need the confidence and support to believe that they can do that work. And so I think that connecting with individuals within institutions and providing them with confidence and helping them think through problems that no one else is available in their institution to help them think through is a way to build social capital, but also moves your agenda forward, because those folks can then create change in a way that maybe you couldn't create from outside whatever the institution is. So, an example would be school food. If you have a food service director who is interested in farm to school, but nobody else around them is really supporting it, how do you help them build the case for what they're trying to do? How do you provide them with the resources? And how do you support them as individuals and say, this is really great work, you're doing a great job, you're important, and people are going to thank you for this later. People need to hear that. Coaching, this I think is really important. And again, as a younger woman, coaching can reverse dynamics sometimes with a person who has power over you. And that could be a funder, or that could be a fiscal sponsor, or it could be a boss. And I've used this many times and found it to be very effective. So, and I think that there's a difference between trying to please the boss and showing that you're trying to please the boss, and trying to support the boss. And I think that when somebody senses that you are genuinely trying to help them reduce their stress, move their work forward, they really respond to it with respect, especially if you have good advice. And so, so an example of reversing dynamics, I guess, is that I had a boss who hired me to start this organization. And at one point he was under the gun from a funder who wanted him to demonstrate all of the impacts of their work since they first started getting funding 5 years beforehand. And they wanted stories from the field, and they wanted numerical outputs, and they wanted interviews with stakeholders. And he was like, I have no time to produce this. How am I going to produce this out of the blue? And so I talked with him about it, and we talked through some ideas. And then and it had very little to do with me because it was not my work, but I came back to him with a detailed evaluation plan. And I was like, I created this conference call account where we can call people and interview them. We can record the interviews. We can use the interviews as audio for a video. If I know somebody who can put a video together using this audio that talks about, with images and we can do this cheaply, and, we can create this little video for a low budget. And here's the list of people that we could interview, and here's how we can organize with staff to get this done. And he was so grateful, and it was a personal source of stress for him that was impacting him personally and making him unhappy and sick. And the fact that I was able to come through along with some of my colleagues with a plan, I think really impacted him personally, because he felt supported. And it is lonely at the top, and people do need support who have power. And so that was, and that was really important for me in terms of getting support from him in the future. And then kind of the last of the 4 points, coaching lasts a lifetime. So the thing that I've learned is that, people that you help to get situated, if somebody is trying to get into local food work, or they're new to their job, sometimes the support you provide for that person during a tough period leads to really unexpected results. That person might go on to start their own nonprofit, and that does amazing work. There's some folks that I coached a little bit earlier on in my time in West Virginia who ended up starting a mobile market, and a mobile farmers market that was quite successful, and a big CSA for lower income folks that traveled around Wheeling, West Virginia. And those folks were folks that I spent time with on the phone, talking about how to approach their organizational structure and how to approach their funding. And that's really beautiful to see. It's really gratifying. So I think that sometimes we get really focused on structures and institutions, and we sort of lose sight of the individuals that are moving within those structures and institutions. And the only real capacity I think you can build in the long run is in individuals, just because funding comes and goes and things fall apart, but people remain, hopefully. I found that generosity breeds generosity. So I found that when I was generous with other people and helping them with grant applications, that if I helped folks to obtain funding, I found that the time that I spent helping other folks to obtain funding more than came back to me in my ability to raise funding, because the funders in our region were aware of me and the fact that I was helping other people to obtain funds, and they liked that spirit of generosity and collaboration, and they wanted to support it. And so I find that sometimes investing in others is actually investing in yourself. And I also think that we sort of created, I think by being really transparent with other folks about our intentions and really generous with our assistance and helping other people get resources, we helped to create a world that was the kind of world that I wanted to work in, where people felt comfortable being trustful and generous with their time. And really created in the last annual conference before I left was really an incredibly positive environment where people were really jazzed up and excited to talk to each other. And it was the 1-year birthday of our working groups. And so we served birthday cake, and all these people were eating birthday cake and like having a great time talking about their working group work. And everybody was just so happy. And it's like, that counts for something. I think that's movement building. So I think for me, generosity, I think I'm talking too long here, but generosity kind of means listening to people. It means being honest and transparent about your intentions as an organization. So, I think funding is very important. So if you're going to go after funding, let people know you're going to go after it. If you know what your plans are, let people know what your plans are. Just communicate earlier rather than later about if some big change is happening in your organization, things like that. Being entrepreneurial and helping other people solve their problems, I kind of talked about. And I found that had many benefits for me, and then expressing gratitude a lot. So this is maybe a little bit of a side note that's not quite about coaching, but it is about the idea behind providing coaching for others, because I think generosity in the nonprofit world, it creates returns. So going back to the coaching topic, so these are just some characteristics of coaches, and I borrowed this from my friend Barbara Wyckoff, who just runs an incredible leadership training program for the National Network of Forest Practitioners. And if you're ever looking for just a really phenomenal trainer to help younger leaders kind of develop themselves as leaders, I recommend Dynamica Consulting and Barbara Wyckoff. Her name's down at the bottom there. She's really phenomenal and works mostly with sustainability professionals. So this is some content from her. So she talks about masterful coaches being present, being caring, being authentic, and inspiring, and rigorous. And I think the rigorous piece is important. So being supportive, but also setting high expectations for the people that you're working with and holding them accountable to those expectations. And this is all in a handout that comes from Barbara that I'm going to send out to everybody who is on the call today. So you can spend more time with some of her material, which I really recommend. And I think this is really interesting. So this is kind of like a grid of coaching relationships and power dynamics. And so she kind of identifies these 4 different types of coaching. And I just think this is so helpful. So you have sort of the scale of, do you have the power? Does the other person have the power? And then you have this question of, is it your issue that you're working on, or is it the other person's issue? So who's kind of getting, whose problem needs to be solved? And so if they have power and it's your issue, then that you're trying to solve, then you're in a situation of coaching upwards. So trying to get somebody who has more power than you to maybe to take a different approach. If you have more power and it's your issue, then it's this remedial or performance coaching. So maybe you have a staff person that you're coaching, and you're trying to get them to where they support what you need to be done. If it's your issue, if it's their issue and they have power, you have this peer coaching situation, bottom left in green, where you're not in a direct power relationship, but you're just supporting the other person. And then if you have more power and it's their issue, you have mentor coaching, which is kind of the traditional mentorship that we think about when we think about mentors. And so, all 4 of these things are things that happen all the time. And I think coaching upwards might be my favorite, actually, because I think it comes in handy a lot. But this is just kind of a framework to think about. And then they identify some special challenges, so we'll come back to this side. So I would ask you to think, we're not going to talk about it yet, but I would ask you to think about some examples from your life of when you've used these types of coaching and what you've learned from them. And then we're going to come back to that question later. So this is again from Barbara, and she adapted it from Robert Gass, who's another person who works on coaching. And so these is kind of the stages of coaching. So, and this is sort of a specific frame for coaching, but this is like if you're having a conversation with somebody and you're trying to help them through a problem. So, so he talks about first you explore. So a part of exploring is clarifying what the issues are and then creating a vision for desired outcomes. And then the second stage is shifting. So this is where you're helping the person to reframe their interpretation of the situation, might be moving beyond some limitation in their perspective, like, feeling like a victim or wanting to blame someone or being kind of stuck in the past or being too focused on problems and not on opportunities, or maybe misinterpreting something that someone else is saying or doing and casting it in a negative light when it should be in a positive light, or sometimes the other way around. A kind of coaching that has been helpful for me actually is sometimes I feel frustrated by situations and I accept blame for not being able to move forward with a certain person. And I need someone to say to me, he's a man and you're a woman and he's just acting like a man. and sometimes I need someone to say that to me so that I recognize what the dynamic is, and it helps me to dismiss it. It helps me to realize that I need to move past this and not take personal responsibility for my inability to influence this person. And then, so you're kind of you're reframing, and then you're also identifying and addressing barriers. They might be, tangible barriers, intangible emotional barriers, acknowledging emotions, talking about emotions a little bit with helping someone move forward in a difficult problem, I think is really important. And then generating some options. And then the third step is deciding. So this is where you're kind of looking at the options, you're helping the person to make some clear decisions, and then you're trying to make sure that what they're deciding is aligned with what their desired outcomes are. And then the fourth step is acting. So that's pretty obvious. So identifying action steps, anticipating challenges. And then something that I think is really important is building in accountability. And I think this is, so if I were going to say what maybe the two most important aspects of coaching have been for me, it's been to clearly articulate problems and options to people, having listened to them and heard them, probably just sort of framing the problem, and then helping them figure out what they want to do next, and then plan. Okay, so like, when am I going to follow up with you to make sure that you did the things you said you were going to do today? And how are we going to record what those things are? And how can I hold you? Because everybody needs accountability, no matter who they are, whether they're high in the food chain or low in the food chain. And that's a real service you can provide for another person. So just a side note, I'm not going to go through all of these, but coaching, I think, really is a listening process. And then, like I talked about, reflecting and then framing choices. And so listening skills come in really handy for coaching, and just being willing to suspend judgment, to sort of enter the other person's frame of reference, and to really sort through their ideas and understand what their main ideas are, and often repeat those ideas back to them, so that they hear themselves the way that you're hearing them, so you understand, so that you're sure that you understand their problem. So that's sort of what I have. And I can give more examples and rattle on some more, but I'm interested in what you all think about this. And I'm particularly interested in examples of how you've used these different types of coaching in your own work, or maybe insights that you've had about how you would like to use these types of coaching in your own work. So I'd like to kind of turn it over to you to react to these 4 types of coaching and see what examples you have or what thoughts you have. And don't forget to unmute yourself if you want to talk. Any reactions?
This is Lynn. I'll let other people keep collecting their thoughts too. Just wanted to share a lot of the professional development I've been doing this year, and that we've had even through A&R and Extension, has been on the notion of mindfulness, which, typically in the past would have been kind of one of those soft or touchy-feely, or it isn't something that, at least that I had heard about in work up until the last year or so. And included in that is then deep listening. And that's one thing, and we do this even in our team meetings too. We're trying to be really intentional about listening to everything that the person is saying and kind of staying in the present moment. And it's, for me, who I tend to be analytical, and I want to think and I can fix this. Sometimes there's probably some ego involved, of course there would be, but sometimes I really want to help people. But I find if I stop trying to create an answer and I listen to the person, the conversation really helps them find the answer, which most of the time they're capable of at least getting part of it or most of it just by talking and saying things out loud and hearing themselves. And then they might go, oh gosh, wait, no, I don't need to do that step. Or, oh, there's 14 steps in between. How did I just jump from here to here? So really just that, taking a deep breath and inviting them to do the same, and listening, and then kind of parroting back to them and saying, well, is this what I heard you say, or whatever. It doesn't sound like it should be that hard, but for me, at least, as a person who is both someone who wants to help and fix, just stopping, staying present, and listening it's a challenge for me still, but it's been amazing in the kind of relationships I develop both at work and personally. So just just that, if there's any way that you can, if you have any interest in this, if you ever have opportunities to learn more about mindfulness or present moment or deep listening, those might be other areas of interest.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I have that challenge too with just listening and not wanting to step in with solutions. I definitely do. And I sometimes stepping in with solutions can be good, especially if the solutions came from the person you're talking to, where you can articulate something that they've just said to you, and then you kind of write it down and clarify what it is for them. But something I read a little while ago about talking to people who are grieving is that it's really important not to try to solve the problem when someone is grieving a death. It's important to just let them talk and tell them that you're there and recognize there's no resolution you can provide to death. And it's an odd thing to bring up, but I've gone through periods of grieving in my life of local food work and in nonprofit work where something I did was very unsuccessful, and I just had to regroup, and I was sad about it for a while. And we have these emotions that we're carrying around with us that we often don't acknowledge, and so I think it is useful to keep that in mind. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is just let somebody work through their emotions in front of you, or whatever it is, or maybe it's like working through logistical stuff or kind of more intellectual stuff. And maybe re-articulating back to them what they just said. Yeah, I totally agree. Other thoughts?
This is Ellen. I'm with Buena Vista County Extension. And this is pretty timely for me, actually. I am the Master Gardener Coordinator, and we're preparing for training here in the fall. And I've only been with Extension just under 2 years now. And my background, I was a former manager, so my coaching came from that employee-employer relationship. And, whether it be performance or whether it be goal setting and things like that, there was always that employment element to the coaching relationship. And I feel like I did a pretty good job with that. But now in my role as coordinator, I'm working with volunteers. And they don't have to work with Extension if they don't want to. Mm-hmm. And so, it's a different dynamic. And I'm really excited. I have 16 people signed up for Master Gardener training. So we're talking about a lot of volunteer hours here. However, I have 2 of them that are very, very outspoken organic proponents, have zero tolerance for any use of any chemicals, and I foresee some issues because they can be very offensive, and they just have no ability to listen to anybody else's reasoning behind using chemicals or not. And we come from an agriculture community, and I have a couple of farmers that are part of this new group that are training, and so I can see that the things you've just talked about are going to be useful to me relatively soon, I'm afraid.
And I think even maybe talking to those people about coaching skills, one way to have a conversation with someone you disagree with is to ask them a lot of questions so that you can allow them to fully air out where their point of view comes from. And sometimes that helps you get at the root of the disagreement. And then it helps you to have a much more civil conversation. And so if those folks are armed with the skill set of asking a lot of questions rather than like coming right at people with their opinions, they might actually learn a lot more from their interactions with other folks that they deal with as master gardeners. And, so that could be a tool that you could employ as a trainer of master gardeners, is encouraging them to learn coaching skills so that when they go out and work with the public, they're effective coaches for people that they work with. I mean, I don't mean coaching someone into coming around your opinion, but sometimes it's just a better way to interact with folks is through that questioning mindset and listening mindset.
Right. Well, we have orientation the week before classes start, so I think I will include some of this.
Great.
Just general information. So thank you. I appreciate it.
Sure. Yeah. And check out the handout that we'll send out too. Make sure that Lynn has your email address. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Other thoughts?
I just want to introduce myself. My name is Kelly Hansen, and I've started a new project with the Iowa Association for Educating Young Children. And Lynn knows a little bit about me just because I've kind of emailed her a few times recently. But thank you for inviting me to be a part of this call today. I think the one thing that really stuck out as being an interesting point when you talked about everybody needing accountability steps. And I think I've kind of been given a big project and I can go any direction that I want to go with it, but it's kind of hard to know where to start sometimes. So I think that was really enlightening when you just said, not only do you need personal accountability steps, but also whoever you're working with. And I think highlighting the different power roles that you were talking about really stuck out for me with that accountability piece.
Yeah, I found it helpful to try to assume that everybody wants to hold themselves accountable and that they just don't always have the tools to do so. It helps me to be less cynical when I'm frustrated with other people. And that is as true with bosses and supervisors and funders as it is with people who are staff or peers. So I think those looking at accountability as a tool and not sort of an emotional thing can be helpful. Other thoughts? Or anyone who wants to introduce themselves too, since we have some newer people on the line?
This is Arlene. For those of you who don't know me, I'm on the local food team too at Iowa State University Extension. And I was thinking about what you said, Savanna, when you said that with our bosses, or our supervisors, you can be somebody who's just trying to please your boss, or you can be somebody who's actually trying to support your boss and help your boss reach his or her goals. And I was just thinking about that because I don't think I've ever thought about my work in that way before. I think I've always thought about my work of like, you make the boss happy, you know?
Yeah.
I don't know, like, do you have any ideas of how you would shift kind of that dynamic between a person and their supervisor as far as shifting towards really supporting the goals of or the needs of your superior?
Sure. Well, so I'm a big believer in being honest with yourself about the leverage that you have in the position where you are and the leverage that your institution has. And some institutions are really good for some things and really bad for some things. And to give an example, I think Extension is really good at providing structure and training, and also can access resources and provide capacity in some cases. There may be things that Extension is not as good at. There are certain groups of farmers, smaller farmers, especially crop farmers, who may not have as good of a relationship with Extension. And so trying to sort of organize with those farmers, we may not be in as good of a position to do that as some other types of organizations like PFI. I mean, depending on what the goal is, you may or may not be in the most effective position to achieve it. So I feel like it's really important to first assess what your organization is doing, and then assess what its strengths and weaknesses are. Identify what part of change, whatever the changes that you want to see, what part of change is your organization in a good place to achieve, and then what part of that change does your boss or superior or whoever it is, what part do they have control over? I think kind of like seeing things in the context of how your influence over your superiors and your superiors' influence over their organization and your organization's influence over the world at large. I think being honest with yourself about what that looks like is sort of a first step to being stepping out of some of the traditional sort of emotional relationships that we have to the idea of bosses and starting to think strategically about how we fit into this bigger picture. And so, so with our team, Arlene, I think about the kinds of things that Craig has access to. And then I think, what is Craig in a position to do? And then I think, how can I help Craig to do those things? And a part of how I can help Craig to do those things is by being a supporter and advocate for Craig and making him feel good. And so that he can get up in the morning and do those things that I think are important. And so I can both advocate for him to do those things, and I can also, I can apply pressure and sometimes be at odds with him, but I can also be his friend and care about him as a person and give him enough charity that I recognize that he's trying to do the best he can with the resources he has, and expect that he's always trying to do his best, and that I need to help him do his best so that we can all get where we want to go. So that's sort of how I think about it. I don't know if that helps.
Sorry, it took me a second to unmute. I guess as you were talking, I was kind of thinking about extension and the larger extension. I don't even know if I have a big enough picture of to even know like what is extension well positioned to do and not and such. And maybe that just requires some conversations with other people who understand extension better than I do.
Well, I think it's really worth thinking about what you want to do, and then whether extension, like what are the ways in which extension is in a position to move those things forward. You know what I mean? Like if what you really care about is helping beginning farmers, say like young and beginning farmers, then like what are the ways realistically, like all programmatic questions aside and things that sound good on grant applications, like what do you actually see extension doing that's really going to help beginning farmers? Is it like, do they need money? Do they need, people to call up and that they can just chat with when they're feeling down and depressed about how hard it is to be a beginning farmer? I mean, and like, does extension have, which of those things does extension have that within your sort of like sphere of awareness? And then like, how can you get those things to farmers through your influence over the people that you have influence over in extension? So, I mean, I feel like all of this stuff, I feel like everything is easier if you can align your personal values and goals with your work. And it just starts with that. And then what are the tools that you have available to you and how do those move forward those values? Because if you're not aligning your work with your values, then then you fall into these habitual relationships and power dynamics that disempower you and make you frustrated. I don't know. I feel like I'm just like up on my philosophical soapbox here, but I feel like personal values are really important. If you're coming from a place of personal values, it becomes easier to navigate those relationships with superiors because you start seeing them as other people who are also people, and how can we align our values to move forward the things that I think are important.
Savanna, I think that's really a great comment for what Ellen was talking about too. It's one of the things, I used to work for a nonprofit and there, I faced a lot of the same kind of folks that have values that are very antithetical to certain forms of agriculture or oppositional, and that was really, it became really challenging when people are unwilling to kind of be open. But one thing I found that was really helpful is to kind of keep going backwards on core values until you got someplace where you could agree. So, like Ellen, when you're talking about farming practices, that's probably not the place to start the conversation, but you might be able to go backward and say, well, I bet everybody in this room really cares about people having, being able to make their own choices about healthy food or how they take care of the land. Or I bet we all want to be good environmental stewards, or I bet we all want to have a legacy where we pass things on to our grandchildren better than we found them. And I know that sounds, again, kind of lofty or way out there or philosophical, but sometimes when you're looking for common ground, you have to start back there so you get some people nodding their head to say, well, yeah, of course I want to make sure that the world is a better place for my grandchildren. Or, yeah, of course I believe everybody should have access to the kind of food that they want. And that's it. And if you can just find one place of agreement, it seems like, I don't know, it shifts the power in the room, because if you've all agreed to something, then there's not levels. You're at least starting by saying, we can at least be here. And then we can talk about a lot of other things after that. And it doesn't mean that there won't still be disagreements or really strong feelings based on powerful values. But I think it's really helpful to get to a place where at least you can start with everybody agreeing on something, even if it's really big, really vague, and really general. And you know, there may be a lot of work that just has to go on with conflict management and things like that. But sometimes you can get a lot further by finding a place of agreement to start with too.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes I think people are inclined to disagree because actually they are feeling out of place or cornered or attacked, and it makes them more antagonistic in a conversation. And that's where this comes back to personal relationships and coaching opportunities, because the more people in the room you have a personal relationship with, where either you've invested something in them or they've invested something in you, the more comfortable they're going to feel when these difficult conversations come up. And letting someone invest in you and be your mentor is just as effective as investing in someone else and being their mentor. So if there's somebody that you know who comes from a totally different walk of life and you don't really understand where their opinions are coming from, let them be your mentor. Like go up to them and be like, I want to understand how to, I want to hear what you think about how I should do this work, or what recommendations would you make to me? And would you be willing to have lunch and give me some advice, And it's sort of like this rule of hardball, right? That if you let someone do you a favor, they'll be dedicated to you for the rest of their life. And so that's, you can be a mentee as well as a mentor. And I think it's surprising sometimes how many of those tensions that seem like ideological tensions can start to melt away when you have these relationships of trust with people that are really premised on individual relationships.
We have plenty of time, so if you've got other questions. Oh, sorry, someone else?
Yeah, I was just going to tag on a little bit of a tangent on the outspoken community partners, because that's just life. There's always going to be people like that, but I also want to make sure, I guess in my experience, there's a definite distinction between being a coach and being an expert, especially when you're an extension person. And, coming to a conversation as an expert changes the conversation than coming to a conversation wanting to learn together about what are the circumstances, how do, facts and science apply to things, and, where can people find that common ground? I think sometimes it's a challenge, my opinion, that, extension people are hired to be the experts in their field, and sometimes coaching can be kind of hard for them, especially when it's requires you to, sit around a table and look at a community problem and try and craft a path for how that's going to be solved. But the coaching techniques that Savanna has mentioned are, as you were going through, I'm like, oh, well, that's what it's called. I get examples of, times where I've used all of those. And the listening part is key to that, and then helping people be connectors. So a long time ago, as a kid, I always admired the people that could ask the really awesome questions. So I wanted to grow up being an awesome question asker and, look smart by using big words and those sorts of things. And the more I get into the work and the older I get, I realize I can't remember everything. So now I feel like my charge in life is just to be a really great connector and being able to find things to connect to people and the issues that they're facing. So sometimes I know the answers, lots of times I don't, but I know where to find the answer, and making those connections either with people or resources or organizations is what I try to do, try to excel at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what's nice about that is you don't have to have expertise to do that. You just have to be connected, right? And it's like the more you connect people with each other, the more people you're connected to, and then the better of a connector you are. And so it's like, I did a lot of that too. And I found that, again, as a person who had pretty limited social capital and kind of limited expertise in what I was working on, it was one of the most effective things I could do, was to be a connector. And people really appreciate it, because a lot of times they don't run into someone who will do that for them.
Well, and I think too, maybe local foods is just the type of area where, there isn't enough history, or there isn't enough of that institutional knowledge to have the experts. We're all kind of, feeling our way through things together. And I think you have to be able to function that way in order to make any sort of improvements or any sort of progress.
Yeah. Yeah.
I just want to really, I guess I just want to let people who don't know you, Teresa, both you and Arlene, this is Lynn, have actually been mentors to me in listening, because I think you're really good listeners. And I really appreciate the fact that you've made me become a better listener by just the speed at which you listen. And sometimes you just need some time to process, and that I've learned pregnant pauses are really not a time for me to babble. Craig is like this too, but they're a time to be quiet with people like you and Craig and Arlene, because you're thinking and it's going to be worth listening. So I really appreciate you two and Craig, who have different personalities. You truly have taught me a lot. You've been mentors to me, and you always will be. I love the connector part. I like to do that too. The thing that's been really good for me is to create a sense of humility also, to just have to say a lot of times, you know what, I don't know the answer to that, but I'll either find it for you, or I'll call someone who does know that, or I'll be that go-between. Let me save you some time. How can I do that? And Teresa's been part of this. Like, I had a gal at AE Dairy who was looking for a female dairy blogger. Please, if anyone on this call knows a female dairy blogger, let me know. We're having a hard time doing that, but it's like, and it's a person who's going to be involved in an event that we're having, and these aren't even this isn't even part of my bailiwick. It's not my forte, but I really want to help this lady because she's supporting an event. I think AE Dairy is a good organization. So there is, I guess it's kind of challenging sometimes, but it also does, like I said, it gives me a sense of humility and realizing I don't have all the answers, but it's sort of fun to go out and look. And I like research too. So anyway, thanks.
One thing I wanted to say about being a connector is I found that, like, if you have access to extension and you understand how extension works, or other institutions, sometimes a really great service you can provide to people is helping them to navigate the structures of institutions and understand where are the resources, who controls the different resources, how are these people all connected with each other. Like in West Virginia, I spent a lot of time at meetings with the Family Nutrition Program, which controlled the SNAP Ed funds, and oversaw the nutrition outreach instructors, and it was a part of extension, but the way that those funds are sort of controlled and who's in charge of them is often really confusing because of the way they're granted out federally, and was able to connect farmers markets and other people with the Family Nutrition Program in ways that they hadn't previously been connected, to get nutrition outreach instructors doing demonstrations at farmers markets and bringing their nutrition classes to farmers markets. And it's something that I wouldn't have been able to do if I hadn't taken the time to understand those institutions and then kind of mentor other people in who they needed to talk to, and how to, and there was even like some mentorship with nutrition outreach instructors themselves who didn't know how to access funds to purchase local food for their demonstrations. And so we had to work with their superiors to figure out how to do that. So sometimes I think being this sort of navigator helper is useful too. So maybe, I don't know if we're going to need the full hour and a half, but I wanted to see if other folks had thoughts they wanted to share. Or we could also, so I had kind of one more question on here, which is how have local coaching skills proved useful in your local foods work, which I haven't specifically talked about. I wondered if anybody had a story that they could tell. How about some of the folks we haven't heard from yet? Anybody out there just like with their wheels turning who wants to speak up?
You guys hear me?
Yeah, sort of.
Okay. Maybe I have to move closer to my computer or something.
Is that Ash?
Yeah, this is Ash.
Hi.
Hey, I was just thinking about some of my work, like specifically with like the Iowa Food Cooperative, and a big part of my job is just trying to stay on top of what farmers are doing so that I can push their work out and help market them. And so I feel like I've used coaching skills a lot and just trying to encourage people to post more, like, you know, on social media about what they're doing, or be sure to email me to let me know so that I can help grow their business. And it seems like then people do actually really enjoy that, and then I can help make connections for them with like the restaurant community and stuff like that. And it seems like people really appreciate that kind of stuff too, as far as like making connections and using coaching skills. I feel like those are areas, but I didn't really think about like I was thinking actually earlier this week that one of the things that I'm really good at is connecting people, and how can I capitalize that in my local foods coordinator job. And just trying to take the things that I have learned from working more in like the food hub world and applying those concepts to my local food coordinator job, which is something I think I've been kind of struggling with. So this has been really helpful. So thanks, Savanna, for doing it.
Any kind of lessons learned come to mind from your experience coaching farmers with social media or with Iowa Food Co-op? Anything you learned about how to be good at doing that?
I just try to be really positive and like excited about, like, just take a genuine interest in the farmers and what they're doing, and just try to be really positive and like, I want to help you grow your business. I really believe in what you're doing, and this is how you can help me help you.
Mm-hmm. Great. Anybody else? Last chance to share your story.
I guess the one that comes to mind for me is, you know, the story of, we've been doing a lot of farm to school work, and we were getting our food service directors together to, you know, talk about how can we do more. And, you know, we were showing them different things, you know, having them do workshops with knife skills and preparing different recipes and those sorts of things. But it wasn't until we sat down one day and we're like, okay, great, now you have all the skills and we found farmers for you and we have, you know, all these things put into place to really make this happen, when they asked the question of, yeah, but we could really, you know, it would just be nice to have ideas for menus, or, you know, we could really use help with this. And it's like, oh, so it actually turns into, I want to say more work. Keep in mind, tongue in cheek, I tend to be very sarcastic, but sometimes you're coaching, you know, just sitting there and listening to people leads to more projects. And, you know, the farm to school cycle menu ended up being one of those bigger projects of just sitting and listening to people with what they were struggling with, and how can we help them reach some of those barriers. So it's really interesting on how after a certain amount of time, once you develop that level of trust, you can really start to find some great and creative ways to address things that they're just struggling with.
Mm-hmm.
Well, like everyone, probably if we don't, I don't want to cut anybody off, but also there are some people that don't like to share, and that's fine. If you do have things to share later where you thought about something, or we send out this information and you feel like it would be helpful, something comes to mind, feel free to hit reply all and share that information with folks. I think what I'll probably do is send out a copy of the recording and the information Savanna has to this group. So if we, if it forms as a cohort, you'll have each other kind of to create a database if you want. And then eventually I'll share it maybe a little bit broader. I think this could be really valuable for a lot of folks on the REFASWIG listserv. And as always, if you do use any of Savanna's PowerPoints, just make sure that there's appropriate citation or attribution, especially to her friend, but then also to Savanna for the great work that she's done. So if we were sitting in a room together, I would be saying, let's give Savanna a round of applause, but maybe we can just do thumbs up. Way to go. Yeah. Good job, Savanna.
Thank you.
I would like to send out a very brief, I'll try and keep it very brief, evaluation that just tries to get your input. And I'm not, interested in judging Savanna or each other or anything like that. So it's not going to be that, but we'll talk about the topic and the presentation, logistics, the time, amount of time. And then in order to save time, and because some of us, again, need to think a little bit before we can just, pop up with things, I'll also put a line in there where you can let me know about a topic, and if you either know of a speaker or would be willing to be a speaker. And I'll try and get that put together, and then I'll run it by Alice or Arlene, or maybe even Savanna, who's done some evaluation work. But it'll be pretty simple. But as Savanna said, I hope this is the most talking that I ever do on these calls. I just kind of want to be the person who gets the Zoom and maybe wraps it up, like this. So if one of you would like to present and you have a topic that you found has been very helpful, let me know that on this evaluation. Once I get the information, I'll put it all together, and if I don't, I might send it out and say, hey, this came up with 2 or 3 people. So how about this for a topic, and would one of you be willing to present, or do you know someone who could present on this topic? So I think this should kind of be, peer-led, if at all possible, or if we need to bring someone in, if it's someone that you've heard about and it's like, hey, I just haven't been able to get a hold of them, let us know. If not, that's fine. The local food team, we can also use some of the resources we have to find additional speakers too. I don't want to create more work for you. But certainly it would be really helpful to have topics. So if you guys can let us know about topics, that would be fabulous. And I'll try and come up. We did this survey from you guys, and I'll try and add those. I'll put those on there just to give you things to think about, but feel free to add additional ones too.
And I just want to add, if you have a topic you're thinking about that you know something about, but you don't feel like an expert on, you feel like you could lead a discussion on, those topics I think would be fair game too. Like, I didn't really feel like I was an expert on this topic, but I thought it was interesting. And then I went and tracked down some materials and borrowed from some materials, and you could send out reading to folks ahead of time to discuss as a group, and start with a little presentation about what was in the reading and then have a discussion about it. So it doesn't necessarily have to be an expert model.
Yes. Thanks, Savanna. Perfect. And if you want to do it together with someone, if you know something about it and you think, yeah, but I really like, I just don't feel like I know quite enough, but I know this person, that's cool. I mean, I don't know that we could do a panel, but we could certainly go from person to person. So don't feel like you've got to have the corner on the market either. So yeah, I will work on an evaluation form. I'll try and get that done later today and send it out. I know tomorrow's Friday, so maybe I'll get it done, before the end of the week, and it'll be in your inbox, so you can do it. But if you could respond, and then also, I will put down, maybe best date again for the next one, and see, or I should probably do that. Should I do a doodle poll? Does that work best for an actual date in the next month, do you think? For those on the line, is a doodle poll, does that work for everybody?
That works for me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. So there'll be two things, and I'll try and send them in the same email so that they're for easy access. There'll be a short evaluation and a doodle for the next date. Again, if you see topics that you just really have no interest in or it doesn't work for you, this isn't a mandatory group ever, obviously. We want it to be helpful, but we know that we're not always going to get things that are interesting for everybody. So you can feel free to drop in anytime, and there's no obligation. So are there any questions on logistics or next steps, or does anybody, if you have a suggestion right now, I'm not opposed to taking notes too. But are there any comments before we part ways at this point? And thank you so much, everybody, for taking time out of your day to attend. We hope this was a good and helpful presentation. So any comments, thoughts?
I thought this was good. I appreciate it. Thank you, both of you.
Thanks, Ellen. It was nice to meet you over Zoom.
I'm working from home. I'm on vacation. I didn't even brush my hair this morning. My grandchildren are coming, and I told them I'd have cupcakes, so I'm signing off.
Wow.
Thank you.
Well, as you can see, I have a hat on, and that means hat day with the hair. So
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Kelly, it was great to meet you. Yes, we'll be having coffee next week, and I'm really looking forward to working with you. So super.
Yes, and thank you for inviting me again.
Absolutely. All right, folks, if we don't have anything else, this was great. Again, thank you. I learned a lot. Savanna, thank you for taking your time out. I know you're really busy, but and then look for the evaluation and doodle poll, and look forward to the next conversation. You guys have a great week and weekend.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.